Hello and good morning. Thank you for being here for the first Baltic event on EU enlargement. When I say the first, I very much hope that the Baltic Initiative on European Reform will continue organizing these events until we have the enlargement. But that is a question of the future. For now, a brief introduction. We are a very small think tank of 3 persons at the moment. Our passion is to have a deep discussion on European enlargement and European reform in the Baltic states, because we do not feel that there is enough of this discussion. And we do not think that this is a kind of discussion that should be left only to policymakers, because civil society and wider society actually should have a say in how we view European enlargement, how we help Europe to make a meaningful enlargement, and how we help those countries which genuinely aspire to join Europe and to be both the contributors and the beneficiaries of its democratic space, its economy, and its human development achievements. So with this very brief introduction, I'd like to welcome you to the first discussion of our event today, which is meant to be a not so traditional way of opening or unpacking this topic for the day. And to do that, I have here with me 2 outstanding experts on Europe and European policies and politics. One of them is Dr. Funda Tekin, who is the director of Institute for European Politics in Berlin and a professor at the University of Tübingen. Funda has also been a member of the group of 12 experts, 6 from France and 6 from Germany, who have together generated proposals for the future reform of the European Union, which has, as some of you may have heard, evoked different reactions, some very positive, some very controversial, but definitely has reinvigorated the debate about the European future. And on my left, I have Ian Bond, who has been at some point Britain's ambassador to Latvia, but who is now, and for many years already, leading foreign policy at the Center for European Reform, both in London and in Brussels. Welcome, and let's start. My first question to you is exactly as we have put it in the title. Why do we need European enlargement? It is a very challenging task. There are very many national interests that are contrary to some of the candidate states joining the EU. There are many economic issues raised. It takes an incredible number of votes where every member state has to agree. And we have a war in Ukraine. We have occupied territories in Moldova and Georgia. We have very many issues also in the Western Balkans. So why actually does Europe need the enlargement? Now, Funda, let's start with you.
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, for having invited me to this discussion and this very topical discussion on the future of enlargement, the future of the European Union. I'm very glad to be here. And this question is, of course, a very broad question, but it is, I think, the key question really that we need to address in these days in order to also get everyone on board. And I think I would like to start first with a more general observation, because the EU's enlargement policy has been in the past decades declared to be the most successful foreign policy or one of the most successful foreign policies of the European Union. And I think this, of course, also linked back to the so-called Big Bang enlargement, when also Latvia joined 20 years ago. We were just commemorating it and celebrating it. And I think the Big Bang enlargement is also and particularly the Baltic states in it, is an example of how successful enlargement can be, and both in terms of the external dimension, but also in terms of the internal dimension, in terms of how the countries integrated, how they benefited and contributed to the single market, etc., etc. Currently, I think why enlargement is so different, and I think there is a bit of a different tendency towards compared to the 20 years ago. It's again a bit about Russia, because Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and I think that has really simply derailed the entire security structure on the European continent, because before that the European Union had the enlargement policy, so with the Western Balkans, the accession track, it had the so-called European neighborhood policy, in there the Eastern Partnership policy in order to stabilize, but not promising, stabilize the neighborhood, not promising full membership. And now it's really, with this war of aggression, there is the need to restructure Europe. And here, of course, enlargement again basically comes into the picture. And this has really also shifted, the weights between the neighborhood policy and the enlargement policy, because if you now realize that within the Eastern partnerships, there are only 2 countries basically left. All the other countries with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have been moved to the accession track. So there's a huge force for and revitalization of the enlargement policy, also with the Western Balkan countries. And I think this is, of course, if you then realize that they are fighting for our values, we need to strengthen the European Union vis-a-vis the Russian aggressor. Of course, the enlargement policy is important, and then you could also kind of add to that the entire economic dimension with regards to the single market. The bigger the single market, the stronger the single market. Of course, realizing that those countries joining with the Western Balkan countries, they will only have a little share within the single market. But I think Ukraine here is the bigger player in the picture. But this is maybe then also the challenges. One final thought, I think it is also with regards to restructuring Europe, it's also important to then build a resilient Europe. And I'm currently working on a Horizon Europe project where we actually try to invigorate, analyze how to invigorate both enlargement policy and neighborhood policy in order to build a resilient Europe, because I'm convinced we need a resilient Europe inside the European Union and in the neighborhood. And Europe can only be resilient if both goes together. And this is something that we have to analyze. And I think I'm going to stop it.
Thank you. And what do you have to add to this?
So the trouble is that I have very little to add to that. But I mean, let me start by saying I think this is a really important initiative. I think there isn't enough discussion of Europe in many European countries. And this is timely. It's coming ahead of the European parliamentary elections. But I think this is a long-term process. And I hope that not only the people in this room, but those watching online and those who hear about this afterwards will understand the importance of this initiative. So what can I add? I mean, not much, because it seems to me that there are 2 fundamental things about enlargement which we need to keep focusing on. One is on the security aspects of it. I think if we've learnt anything over the last, probably 16 years since the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, it is that leaving countries in a grey zone is a bad idea. It is quite destabilizing in Europe. And enlargement is an important part of a stabilization process for our neighborhood. If we had left all of the countries that joined the EU in 2004 in a grey zone, I think we would now be in a much worse European security situation than we are. So the elimination of the grey zone, the consolidation of democratic government in a wider area of Europe seems to me to be very important. Now, clearly we need a neighbourhood policy as well, particularly in the south, where countries don't have the offer of EU membership. But I think for the countries of the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe, this is fundamental to stabilizing them. And the second thing is indeed the economic side of it. So I looked this up. When Latvia joined the EU, GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis was 49% of the EU average. Over the last 20 years, it's now up to 72% of the EU average. Now, there's still a long way to go, but that's actually quite dramatic convergence over that time. Also in terms of governance, back then Latvia was 57th of 146 countries on Transparency International's index, Corruption Perceptions Index. It's now 36th out of 180. So you can use enlargement to strengthen countries economically, to strengthen their institutional resilience, and I think that's extremely important. I think the last point that I would make is I might welcome it or I might regret it, and actually mostly I regret it, but I think we are going through a period where globalization is coming under extreme pressure, and we are becoming a world more divided into blocks. Now, we can resist that to some extent, but we may not be able to overcome it because, you know, other countries, other blocks have a vote in that. And it seems to me that it's quite important that Europe consolidate as much of its region around itself as it can. Now, you know, the British have not contributed to this, it has to be said. Brexit, I think, has been a significant blow. But I think it is important to recognise that taking in, you know, for example, Serbia with significant reserves of lithium, or Ukraine, which is one of the world's largest agricultural producers, is also contributing to the long-term prosperity and security of the whole of Europe, to those countries, but also to us.
Of course, people who are very critical of the EU's desire to enlarge and to accept these candidate countries, I mean also critics in some of these countries, especially at the moment in Georgia, would say that the EU and generally the West have an instrumental approach to these countries. You know, the narratives that are generated in the Kremlin and that are extremely widespread and extremely powerful, unfortunately, in parts of societies, in both in Europe and in the candidate countries, say that the motivation on behalf of Europe is unclear or maybe even dishonest. I'm not going to repeat some of the most outrageous arguments that are being used, but the arguments that are perhaps less extreme, but also sometimes are voiced, is that at the moment Europe is viewing the countries to the east, I mean the three candidates from the Eastern Partnership, as some kind of well, the Russian propaganda word is the buffer zone. We can use some other less propaganda-tinted wording, but the argument is that, look, those countries are not going to benefit as much as they think they are, because they are going to be held in a long accession corridor which is going to last forever. Look at what happened to the Balkans. And meanwhile, Europe is looking at them as a way to buffer up its security. What do you answer to that?
Well, I think my answer to that is their security and our security are inextricably linked. I mean, it's not a question. I mean, you know, in a sense, their problem is that because they have been outside the EU, they have been a buffer zone in a way. Mm-hmm. We haven't felt fully responsible for their security, and I think we have. And perhaps still, we underestimate the extent to which our security and their security is linked. So, you know, I was trying to remember that I think when I was in the Foreign Office in the sort of late 1990s, the Ukrainian ambassador used to be a regular visitor, coming to say, please can you give us a perspective of EU membership? And the British approach at that time was very much to say, no, you know, you're not really, you know, it's not really for you. It's all too difficult. You're too Russian. You know, we didn't use the term Ruski Mir, but I think somewhere conceptually we still saw Ukraine through a Moscow prism.
So there was an assumption, that a kind of silent assumption that influence zones actually exist.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what we've learned over the last 20 years is that you can't just sort of leave countries in that sort of zone, and that a country like Ukraine has agency, a country like Georgia has agency. Even if they're quite small countries, they still have agency, and their security is intimately linked to our security.
Well, indeed, if one looks at the streets in Tbilisi these days, one sees that the Georgian people very much has agency and is very vocal about resisting attempts to deroute or to pivot towards other allies and away from the European path. Funda, what do you have to add to this?
Well, of course, I agree with what Ian has said with regards to the security dimension. So I think I would now elaborate a bit more on this technical thing, because I think what you said with regards to, you know, the Russian propaganda saying that, you know, you might be trapped in this accession procedure for a very long time, maybe never actually exceeding. This is not necessarily only Russian propaganda, I would say, because there is the evidence of the fact that accession procedures do take long. I mean, the Western Balkan countries have been in this process for 20 years. Then we have Turkey, who was in that process even for a longer period of time, and now has kind of left the picture entirely. It's not part of the current debate. So there is evidence for that. And if you then also look into the European Union debate, you also realize that, you know, support for enlargement maybe in general is there. We need enlargement, but if it then really comes to the process and kind of implementing this process, there are then different approaches to that. And you can also look into the public opinion support in the European Union. So according to Statista, there, you know, across the European Union, it's 53% in, I think, end of 2023 in favor of enlargement. And then you have the regional dimensions. Here in Latvia, it's 71% support enlargement, but in Germany it's 42%, you know. And then if you go to France, it's even 35%, you know. So of course there are, you know, it's not a unanimous decision that enlargement actually is a good thing, and we need that. So we also have to build on that. And I think this is basically the dilemma that we need to solve between this really security need for enlargement and then also the transformation need that comes along with the enlargement process, both reforms in the accession candidate countries, but the longer the process takes and the less the trust in the accession promise is, the less countries are going to be willing to reform, and we see that now in North Macedonia, the effects. So if you have the feeling that there are, you know, there is this technical procedure, but there are also other interests that might undermine the accession prospect, then this process becomes undermined, and this is the danger of, or one of the dangers of the accession process and perspective, because I think it's very easy to kind of voice and have a unanimous decision in EU member states on the prospect of accession, but it's difficult to then actually take the unanimous decision on the final actual accession as such. And this is something that we have to be aware of, and we have to kind of restructure the accession procedure in order to find a way out of this dilemma.
Yes, we will get to those challenges in a moment. But before we go there, I'd like to ask both of you to answer just with one or two sentences the question. So as European citizens, if a citizen in France or in Germany or, well, I can no longer say in Britain, but say in Ireland, asked, what's in it in me? What's in it for me? Why should I support EU enlargement, the next EU enlargement? What would be your very short answer to that?
Well, of course, first of all, I think it's a geographic dimension. It's the difference if you talk to someone in France or in the Baltic states, for example, like the proximity to the border and the eastern border. Well, I would say that in general, it's well, maybe I would go with united in diversity. So the more, the merrier. So we have, the European Union can gain strength from enlargement, but I would more also address the fears in terms of, there might, and we have to be transparent about the fact enlargement goes along with costs, but there are also costs of non-enlargement. And those costs, of course, are more difficult to grasp because they are more soft in terms of security, in terms of stability and all that. So you do not really feel that immediately, those costs of non-Europe. The other costs in terms of fear of labor market impacts, etc., they are greater. So I think we need to address both the costs and the non-costs of enlargement.
Indeed, there are costs to non-enlargement as well. Ian, your short response to a European citizen, what's in it for me?
Security, and a bigger single market is good for the economies of all the existing member states. Put very bluntly, poor countries don't buy very much. Richer countries import more. And so, for those of us who are existing members, enlarging the single, for those who are in the single market, enlarging the single market means you've got more customers, you have more economic activity, more goods, more services moving around. That's good for everybody's prosperity. That's why Latvia is not at 49%, but at 72% of the average GDP per capita.
Thank you. Well, let's assume we convinced the hypothetical EU citizen, but let's now move on to the second part, which is also quite intriguing. So what could go wrong? What could be the challenges? I mean, you have mentioned some, Funda, regarding how we have, as EU, have in fact discouraged some part of the populations and part of the elites in the Western Balkans by making this process too long, too dragged out. And I'm sure you have the same and maybe even more drastic examples from the case of Turkey. But also, what are the risks? Assume we can overcome those challenges of our internal decision-making. What are the other risks? What are we facing? I mean, having come back from Tbilisi yesterday, I have some impressions that the risks are quite serious, that the issues of both some kind of not so open but ongoing desire to sit on two chairs, as we can also observe in Serbia, for example, to work both with the EU and with the partners who are not friendly towards the EU is very much a real factor. I also noticed that it's very much a real factor that the populations, when they are tired of waiting, when they do not see the promises fulfilled, the promises which maybe not the EU but their own leaders have made about making it quicker to Europe, sometimes become extremely skeptical about the need for these processes. And for reforms, of course, you need invigorated and motivated populations. You cannot work with, when your people say, well, it has been a while, nothing happens, we don't believe it anymore, why should we reform? So I just mentioned some. There are other risks, I think, and there are other factors. And let's start with you this time.
So I think I'm going to pick up the last point that you made about people not feeling or not seeing the point of making the reforms that are required. And I think one thing that the EU has not always been very good at is saying why these reforms are good in their own right, regardless of whether they lead to membership tomorrow or not. If you are meeting, I don't know, the standards of the Clean Water Directive, that means the water that comes out of your tap is healthier. If you are meeting standards of good governance and transparency through the Procurement Directive, again, that's something which is going to benefit your country, regardless of whether you're actually going to join the EU tomorrow or not. So I think we probably have not done a good enough job of saying these are reforms that are going to benefit ordinary people in the country, regardless of the enlargement process or not. Now, I would say the enlargement process is still very important, but that seems to me to be an issue. I think in terms of other problems that we need to address, it is an issue that so many of the candidates now are in disputes of one sort or another, either with each other or with external powers. And I think that's something which, you've just come back from Georgia, so you know some of this, but 20% of Georgian territory is occupied by Russia. Similar sort of percentage, perhaps a bit less, of Ukraine is occupied by Russia. Moldova has the problem of Transnistria. And I mean, the EU has some experience of dealing with countries that don't control the whole of their territory, for example, with Cyprus. But it's not an entirely happy precedent. And I think more thought needs to be given to how you tackle some of those questions. How do you simultaneously recognize the territorial integrity of a country and ensure that you are not offering a backdoor to bad actors? It's not straightforward. There's a precedent from Germany before unification. The European Economic Community, the Treaty of Rome, had a sort of strange protocol on inner German trade, whereby goods were allowed to circulate between East and West Germany as though they were in a single market, but they were not supposed to move into the rest of Europe. But I don't know whether you can do anything similar to that for the divided countries that are now candidates.
Well, these are, in any case, very interesting examples, because, of course, the question about Transnistria indeed perhaps could be discussed in the context of Northern Cyprus. So there are some parallels. But I agree with you that probably the situation in Ukraine is much more complicated and cannot be directly addressed through those. Funda, what is your take on this?
Of course, again, I can add, well, I had also these points on my list, and I think I can add another example, also one of my take on the first point that Ian made with regards to the reforms in those countries, because I think all of what he has said is, I fully agree, and I can just give another example for that, because also, and here again with my research and experience with EU-Turkey relations, because the accession negotiations of Turkey are blocked, chapters are blocked. Among those chapters who are blocked are chapters 23 and 24, who deal with the judicial reforms. And then, one narrative and one argument from the Turkish side is always, well, we cannot really reform our rule of law system and judicial system because you don't open chapters 23 and 24 for us. And I think this is a wrong argument, because countries, and this is exactly what Ian has said, you need to have an intrinsic motivation to have a rule of law and democracy and democratic system. And the enlargement process can help you and facilitate the reforms you need in order to build these systems. But it cannot be the EU's fault that you don't have that system. And I think this is something where we really need to be aware of the fact that this is not a narrative that also then enters into the Western Balkan countries, etc., the longer the process actually needs, and the further some of those countries actually move away from the European Union. Because I think also Turkey is the case, having been very long in this accession procedure, and nevertheless has moved away from the European Union with regards to standards and values. And I think this is something that we need to try, we need to avoid. And I think here the trust that I mentioned before in the actual accession promise might play a role. I think I would also like to add another challenge, and this is more with regards to the internal dimension of the European Union, and this links back to the so-called informal or fourth Copenhagen criteria, the absorption capacity of the European Union. And that became, the absorption capacity became a big criteria after the so-called Big Bang enlargement, because then the European Union and the member states realized that, you know, a big group of member states joining the European Union might overburden and overstrain the institutional system of the European Union and its capacity to act. And of course, there is now also the conviction that, some have the conviction that the Lisbon Treaty is enlargement proofed, but I think it's still important to also think about and revisit our institutional system, the decision-making system, also the rule of law issue in the European Union, in order to see in how far we can preserve the capacity to act and even strengthen its capacity to act. Although, 9 additional member states might eventually join the European Union. And I think this is important. And here, of course, it's the issue of qualified majority voting in order to avoid vetoes. Because it's always, when we discuss that also in the group of 12, realizing that the Western Balkans and Ukraine together, they would actually be the size of the population of UK that has left the European Union, but it would actually be 8 additional veto players and 9 additional veto players. So of course, this is going to have an impact on the decision making. So this is something that we need to realize. And I think this takes me back to the reform needs. As long as we do not have our rule of law standards in order in our own house, in the European Union, it's very difficult also to demand reforms on rule of law issues from those states who want to exceed the European Union.
Well, you both mentioned reforms of the judiciary as one of the key points of the package of reforms that the EU expects from candidate countries before any serious conversation about membership can take place. And what I notice, it is also one of the most controversial points, not controversial because of its content, but the way it is perceived and the way it is spinned in discussion by people who are critical of the EU's stance on that. Because of course, there is this standard accusation of hypocrisy. Look, you have released the funds for Hungary despite knowing that Hungary is not performing very well on rule of law at the moment, in order to have Hungary's veto lifted for the enlargement process. So after doing that, how can you expect us to be perfect regarding the rule of law and perfect in our reforms of the judiciary? That's one argument one hears all the time. And it is, of course, a slightly manipulative argument, but on the other hand, you cannot completely ignore it. We have to answer something to that. Another one, which one hears also quite often, also among the critics of the EU's position, for example, on the law on foreign agents now in Georgia, is, well, yes, you are blaming us for having this law which demands more transparency from civil society. But on the other hand, when our judges are sanctioned, there was a case when some Georgian judges were sanctioned by the United States, when our judges are blamed for not being fair and not being transparent, then you use the same argument of transparency. So very manipulative actors who know very well that we are speaking of totally different situations here. One is regarding the attempt to control civil society by imposing unrealistic demands. Another one is concerned about the true transparency of conflicts of interests among the judges. But they are put together as one argument, and they're used to undermine the credibility of the EU's demand for reforms of the judiciary in candidate countries. I'm not going to ask you to solve this now, but do you have some suggestions how we can go forward on this?
The fundamental point is that the EU has to operate as a common legal space. Now, obviously there are differences between national bodies of legislation. But the single market, the Schengen area, rely on a common legal space. And I don't have any very good answers to this. But one thing I would say is it's much easier to try to create that common legal space with the kind of conditionality that is available to you while countries are candidates than it is after they have joined. Now, that's a weakness that we didn't anticipate in 2004, but we have seen, particularly with Hungary to some extent, with Poland as well. And I think we probably need to address before any future round. But I think the key point to focus on is that you can't operate a single market and a relatively borderless area if you have judiciaries which are acting in completely incompatible ways. I think it is, for me, one of the most important obstacles to the next round of enlargement.
Well, that is, I think, a basic requirement, but also I think there is another aspect to this. If the judiciary cannot be trusted to act impartially, then that means that it might act in the interest of, for example, political actors. And then it undermines the fundamental values of the European Union, anything to do with human rights, with the ability of civil society to act independently of the government, with all those crucial issues, the ability of opposition parties to remain in the opposition in deeds, not just in words. So all of these things become imperiled if the judges might be politically influenced. And if we do not have that in countries joining the European Union, then we cannot have any guarantee of a rule of law kind of based union in the future.
So, I mean, there's one chink of light, which is the European Court of Justice has finally decided that the European values in Article 2 of the treaty, which include the rule of law, are justiciable. So 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Brussels and there were debates going on, is Article 2 just a rhetorical statement of European values? And most of the Commission lawyers at that time said, you can't go to a court and say the rule of law has been breached and the court will offer you a remedy for that. And what has happened only over the last year or two is that increasingly the Court of Justice has said, no, actually, you can rely on Article 2. That if the rule of law is breached, we will offer redress for that. And for me, that's a chink of light for trying to ensure that this kind of capture of the judiciary at least can be punished at a European level.
Well, we're still to see how that is applied to countries that have been already attempting their inroads into this kind of behavior among the member states at the moment. Funda, what do you have to add on this?
Yeah, well, I think that also, with what Ian has just said in the end, for me it's also, of course, rule of law, democracy, they are part of Article 2 TEU as fundamental values of the European Union. But to me, it's more than that. It's a constitutional principle, and it's really, Ian has said it. The single market, mostly all policies do not function without a rule of law. A functioning rule of law, and also similar principles and a similar understanding of the rule of law, because this is another debate within the European Union that also some member states claim, well, we have a rule of law system, we simply have a different definition of rule of law. So this is, of course, something that makes then the debate difficult. And I think for me, the answer to that is we have to make sure that, and I think also the experience with Hungary actually is part of the reason why this focus on rule of law and democracy in the accession countries has even become more important. Because, of course, you do not want to have another new member states entering the European Union and then also having rule of law regressions immediately or over a certain amount of time. So that is part of the reason why it is so important. And for me, it's really we have to solve the so-called Copenhagen dilemma, which is, exactly the situation that during the accession procedure, there are the Copenhagen criteria, you have leverage and conditionality over these reforms. The moment you enter the European Union, the tools are limited. And I think we need to reform the tools. I mean, this is not an easy task to do, but this is something that we really have to look into. And of course, there is Article 7 TEU on the lifting of the voting rights in the Council. But this, of course, again, requires unanimous decision, which is also one of the reasons why it's currently stuck in the Council. So, but I think we either have to go and try to revise Article 7 TEU, or we have to work on the conditionality mechanism. I mean, you were mentioning the fact that indeed the Commission just defreezed some of the blocked funds just 2 days or the eve before the European Council Summit in December 2023, which was a timely coincidence according to the Commission. But of course, we knew that Hungary was supposed to agree to opening accession negotiation to Ukraine, to agreeing to a new financial package for Ukraine. So in the end, they were then finding also creative solutions with sending Orban to have a coffee while the decision on Ukraine and Moldova was taken. But I think also there is only that much coffee Orban can drink, So I think we might have to find a more sustainable solution to that. And for me, it's really thinking about the conditionality mechanism. For me, the way to go over the funds is something that is a good approach, but maybe we might need to find a way to also kind of broaden it and delinking it also from the budget implementation like that.
And then there's also the question of timing, because the longer we take to change our procedures within the EU to enable the EU not to be paralyzed every time by vetoes of Orban, or in the future maybe Fico, or maybe in the future some other leader who decides to play his own game with European fundamental issues in favor of remaining in power or being popular. What is the realistic timeline, according to you? Again, in 2 or 3 words, before we open the questions to the audience. What is the realistic timeline for the next EU enlargement?
Well, that is a very difficult question. I mean, maybe I'm just going to quote here what we wrote in the report of the Group of 12, because there we at least said, well, we need the commitment from both sides, the EU and the member state candidates, to be enlargement ready by 2030. This does not say that it's really some accession has been implemented by 2030, but at least that both sides have kind of prepared the grounds for actually joining. And I think, I think it might take that time, because that is a very short time frame, and then we will see how things go.
Thanks. Ian, what's your timeline for EU enlargement?
Yeah, I mean, that actually sounds quite quick to me.
Yeah, it is.
There's a lot of work to be done. I mean, maybe it can be, but yeah, I mean that's a challenging deadline. I mean, I would have said probably 10 years from where we are now, but I hope I'm too pessimistic.
Yes, and given that at the time when Ukraine was applying and when it was granted candidate status in 2022, remember there was this ambition, the desire by the leadership of Ukraine to have this process completed in 2 years, which of course was shocking to many Europeans. But the urgency, which guided, I think, partly this desire and this statement, the urgency is actually still there for countries that are facing hybrid threats or open occupation and aggression by Russia. The timeline for us to get our house in order, to get the new rules for decision making that would enable Europe to function with plus 9 or 10 members is one timeline, and the timeline that the Ukrainian people needs to envisage in order to have hope in the struggle is again a different timeline. So we are dealing here with a very, very big clash of expectations, and that's, I think, one of the biggest risks and challenges to this process. Now, I do not think we have a microphone, but if you do have a question, we do have a microphone. Amazing. So let us start with questions from the audience. We have 10 minutes to go. Please, the gentleman on the left, in one of the last rows. And after that, the ambassador of Sweden, yes.
Yes, maybe I'll just stand up. My voice is...
Here comes the microphone.
Yes, we have talked a lot about the eastern expansion of Europe, but there is a kind of a question about the future of Great Britain. Public opinion of Brits says that a lot of people are really have a sour taste in their mouth about Britain leaving the EU, and with time going onward, a lot more Brits say that they would not oppose Britain rejoining the EU again. I would like to ask a question. What is your own opinion about, is there a possibility of the Great Britain rejoining EU? Thank you.
Thank you, and let's give the microphone now to Madam Ambassador in the second row.
I'm sure I need a microphone either.
Do they need one for the streaming though?
And thank you, Funda. I have actually a question for you, Funda.
I'm sorry, but for the stream, maybe we need.
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Funda, you said in your introductory remark, you said something, we need to restructure Europe. The prefix re means going back to something, and I was wondering, I don't think you mean that, but what do you? I wanted to ask you, how does enlargement play along with that comment? What exactly do you mean? Thank you.
I suggest, Ian, you take the question on Great Britain.
Yeah. So I would love, of course, to rejoin the EU. There's a paradox in the answers that people give to this question, which is that if you ask them, was it a mistake to leave the EU? A majority of people say, yes, it was a mistake to leave the EU. If you say, would you like to rejoin the EU? A majority of people say no. You know, at the moment, public opinion is in a mess, I think it would be fair to say. The Labour Party, which seems very likely to form the next British government, has said very firmly it's not going to rejoin the EU, it's not going to rejoin the single market, it's not going to rejoin the customs union, it's not interested in free movement. So it's ruling out a lot of things that I think we could do to bring ourselves closer to the EU, at least in the short term. In the long term, I think it's inevitable that we will get closer to the EU again. And I would hope, you know, in my children's lifetime that we would be able to rejoin. But it also is going to require, I think, the EU to trust that they're not importing Britain's psychodrama again. I mean, I suspect, seeing as it takes a unanimous decision on enlargement, that if you were to ask all the European countries at the moment, do you want the British to rejoin? At least some of them would suck their teeth quite hard before deciding what answer to give. You know, they would not immediately say, oh yes, let's have the Brits back in. Because, you know, the EU has been able to do some things, particularly in the defence field, since Britain left, that it probably wouldn't have been able to do if the British were still members.
Thank you. Now, Funda, about we have to return to restructuring.
Yeah, first on the UK, because I also think if the UK would in the future time eventually reapply for membership, I think the condition on the European Union side would be, well, there is the third Copenhagen criteria. You have to implement the acquis and you have to implement it fully. So I think, and this is, and if we then remind ourselves that the UK has also always been called the so-called awkward member state because it had lots of opt-outs from important policy areas. And I'm not sure whether the EU would be willing to make those concessions once again for the UK, and whether the UK would then be willing to be a fully fledged member of all policy areas. So this is something for the the future to discuss. Thank you for the question with regards to restructuring Europe, because I actually use that term a lot, and I might have to reconsider it then, because I do not want to imply to go back to anything that we already had, but structuring it in a new way. I think this is something that, because the situation is so different currently, and for me, it's really the multidimensionality of these things, and their enlargement policy plays an important role. But I think, given the timeline that we have been discussing and the length this procedure takes, for me, it cannot be the only tool that we use. So we also have to think about other dimensions that we might need to invigorate while the process is going on, because there are the other external geopolitical actors in the region that might have influence, and the longer the accession process takes, the more influence those might gain with regards to China and Russia and even Turkey in the Western Balkans. So there are also things to consider, like, I mean, it's not, might be more the infamous framework, but it is the European political community, the idea of Macron, and I'm sure when Macron was actually putting it on the table, he actually had in mind that that might be an alternative to the enlargement process. He then rephrased it and reframed it afterwards, but really to have some sort of institutional framework to discuss cooperation, energy, climate policies, because those policies are already important to deal together, even irrespective of whether you are a member state or not. Then the connectivity issue, whether you can actually already build upon connectivity benefits and establish some joint projects, etc., in terms of with the region. And then also maybe thinking about the need to capacity building, like military capacity building in that sense. So what can we do with regards to that? So this is, for me, the entire picture of how to structure Europe, and enlargement policy is one central element of it, but it's not the only one.
Thank you very much. Well, as we are approaching the end of our discussion, I would like, first of all, to thank both participants for very bold and, at the same time, well thought through and enlightening insights. And I very much hope that this will be somehow taken over and continued then by the next panel. Speaking of which, on your badges here, you have the QR code where you can see the biographies of all speakers. We didn't kill more trees by printing all your bios, but please, for knowing both about this panel and the next panel, who are the people you're listening to follow this. And I would like also to thank very much the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga for hosting us for the whole day in this wonderful Soros auditorium, and Robert Bosch Stiftung for funding this event and our endeavors to establish debate about the future of Europe in the Baltic states. Now we have a technical break of 5 minutes to rearrange the floor for the next discussion. Thank you very much.